Are
We're
live.
live. So we're actually talking about what Legend of the Battle of the Five Armies, aren't we?
Legend.
Legend of the Armies,
You
Lord of
are just
the
crazy
Things,
into Legend of the
Legend
Five
of the
Ring.
One Ring. Yeah, something
Legend
like
of
that.
the Thing.
Yeah, there is a ring in this one.
Yeah, I've actually played War of the Ring, but I haven't played Battle for the Five Armies.
Hmm.
So I'm curious what you're seeing in this that you like more than War of the Ring.
Yeah, definitely we'll get to that. I'll save it for when we hit some
Yeah.
conversation points. But I do definitely see them as distinct games. I've
yeah.
seen a number of, I don't know, top 10 lists or those sorts of things where people are like, this either replaces, War of the Ring, or you don't need to, own both. And I think they're both doing something a little bit different, which is partly why I wanted to talk about it. Honestly, War of the Ring is my favorite game. It's the game that I have played maybe the most. I've probably played almost 50 plays of War of the Ring.
You have like the Super Fantasy Flight Edition?
No. I'm
and it's your number one game and you don't have the Super Edition?
Oh man, you know what? I can buy like 10 games for the price of that one game, and my game is perfectly functional. So
that's true. Yeah, I saw like an unpacking for that big Monster Fantasy Flight Edition. I was like, good Lord, who would actually buy this thing? And then I knew someone who did it, so I couldn't say much.
Yeah, I really wanted the bigger map. It's like it already is a massive table hog, but I was just excited about this idea of this map literally going from like corner to corner on the table. And yeah, there's something visual about this game that's just so fantastic.
And then they come up with another one called like Hunt for the Ring.
Yeah, it's kind of
on that one.
I have it on like a pre-order again with this shipment that's going to come in hopefully soon here.
Okay, that sounds like you're quite the person to talk about this. You've got your War of the Ring thing going on here. Sweet.
Yeah, for sure. I got a chance to see what Hunt of the Ring looked like when it was in like demo form at Origins, actually with Jeff Gamble of all people, and it was pretty. It looked like it did kind of take just the Hunt for the Ring aspect of the the War of the Ring, and it made it much more into like I see it as like. The Last Friday is a game that they put out, and I feel like they're kind of like we're working towards that direction with the the kind of like hidden movement and Letters from Whitechapel style of game.
Well, that's what Carissa was interested just because of that, because Carissa really loves Letters from Whitechapel. When I said there was like a Lord of the Ring variant on that, she got really interested. But I haven't talked to anyone who actually played it yet.
Yeah. So, well, guys, are we?
I think we're ready.
Are we feeling like
we're ready.
About ready. All I was doing is just posting here on the Longview Guild the link to our live recording. So I know that we've already started
going to join us this time. Usually our Longview recordings, no one cares, but that's okay.
we get some people.
You get a little more traffic on the Good Word Ugly stuff, hey?
Yeah, that's okay.
I think it's just a regularity of the episodes is much more conducive to like a community. Like it just is. It's like a Thursday night. It's every Thursday night.
Yeah,
and Longview, I'm trying to be kind of consistent and have it be, the beginning of the week, but it really is because I don't know. Everybody I think enjoys the Longview in a different way. And I myself am one as well. I've tried it many different ways. Making it sound like
this way, I've tried it that way.
Well, I feel like the main thing I'm talking about is, do I listen to the Longview about a game I've played, or do I listen to the Longview about a game I've never played? And, like to what level? And I've done it with, there's been games that I've never played before and, listened to Longview cold. And I enjoyed that quite a bit, actually. I had never played Through the Ages when I listened to the episode about Through the Ages. And I thought it was just incredible. I thought it was a really great episode. And then there are games that I have really, really loved, and I have listened to those episodes, and I like those too. I feel like there's some nuances that you don't get unless you know the game.
Absolutely.
There's only so much that you can really, especially in podcast form, there's only so much you can do without actually showing a person and having a person play a game to be able to really understand. But, there's only so much we can do with words. But also, like, for a game that I've hated, if I hate a game, am I going to talk, am I going to listen to the episode about that? So, what do you think? And I do sometimes. I've done that before with game, and I'm not going to say it because I'm not, I'm not looking to say like I hate this game, but it really did make me understand, like, and I don't remember with that particular game if I ended up playing it. I don't think I played it again, but it was like if I were to try it again, I knew what mindset to go into it with. And I think Luke, here before we start recording, that's one of the things that's really fascinating to me.
We already are recording.
Your favorite. Well, before we do the countdown for the episode, we're recording. Okay, fine. TC. we have a viewer, dude. So you know what? We do. It's showing up as one. So anyhow, I will go ahead and click on that. I'm going to now share with you guys that live chat because who knows?
Oh, we do have a viewer.
We have a viewer, and I'm about to share that live chat here. If you guys click on this window, it'll be just the pop-out chat. So hello and welcome to everybody watching. Oh my goodness! Whoa!
We have three.
We just jumped up to 4.
Whoa! We win!
Yes. Bing, bing, bing. We need to do like a supporter drive with this.
I scared him off. 1. Oh wow.
Oh. All right. So the main thing I wanted to ask you here before we get started, like, War of the Rings your favorite game? You play 18xx games.
Yeah. In fact, I started playing 18xx pretty much a year ago at this point in time.
Okay.
And it was with the publication of GMT's 1846. It was an access point for me, something that's readily available. I was really excited by it. Learned it myself, taught 2 groups, so probably about 8 different people, and was completely taken by it. Probably played it 7 times in a month. It was just like something that fired on all cylinders for me. And I actually connected with my friend Tyler in Medicine Hat, and he and I run the Chattanooga, which is the train game convention, dedicated to 18xx games. It's going to be a yearly event now. So
nice.
Yeah, which is fantastic. It's one of those things where I was just like, I was taken by it, and it's at a point in my life where I wanted to just I guess I just wanted to start giving back to the board game community in some sort of a way. And hey, you pick up where you're passionate, and that's where I was at that point. So I've gone head first into the rabbit hole, as it were, with 18xx, as I hear many do. And it seems like something is growing at this point in time with the 18xx community. I don't know, maybe it is the access points like GMT's 1846. Maybe it's just a more dialogue happening on podcasts. I mean, there's probably a greater breadth of podcasts in the last 2-3 years than there has been previously dealing with board game content. So yeah, I mean, I'd say at this point in time, I'm focusing more and more of my gaming time on 18xx. And so you have to put in context my favorite games as sort of prior to my encounter with 18xx games.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not like I was, into 18xx and super heavy Euros and then, found War of the Ring. No, War of the Ring was actually probably one of my earlier games that I found. And those tend to make a pretty big impression when they're early on in your sort of gaming career or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, what a perspective though. Yeah, I'm like, but you still are coming back to these games. It's not like you've left who you were. Like you've got some of you in the rabbit hole and some of you still firmly outside of the rabbit hole. Absolutely.
I love games like this, and especially connected to probably, and this will come up over and over, I think, as we're talking, but connected to some sort of story that I have really appreciated in the past. And I was I was a huge Tolkien nerd growing up. I read all the books prior to the movies coming out, and it was something I just really connected with as one of those larger stories and universes. So I think that also plays a pretty big role in terms of my connection to these games. And I think something I'll bring up a little bit in terms of how this game fits in terms of audience, but I think there is that need to be somewhat aware of the story to really find this game as engaging as it is.
Okay.
It doesn't make it a bad game, and I think it's actually stands on its own quite well, but I do think it's built with love and care from people who actually understand the stories, right? So there's something going on there.
Absolutely. Yeah, all those things kind of like just precursors to this discussion we're about to have. So I appreciate you letting me know that. I was just wanted to know, the direction and angles. So I might be prodding you a little bit about
prod
that.
away,
So.
and seriously, especially prod away when it comes to like luck and randomness and stuff like that. Because I feel like as a gamer, I mean, I'm like going through all sorts of different. It like you said about you listen to games that podcasts about games that you hate, and it's like creating these expectations of how do I approach a game. And I find that's like half the battle is of whether I'm going to enjoy a game, right? I mean, enjoyment, whatever you want to call that, is so diverse. And I feel like I can completely enjoy a game like Orongo, Imperial Settlers, or Trains with my wife and other couples because it truly is an enjoyable experience to sit at the table with those people and play those kinds of games. I can enjoy some sort of backstabbing negotiation game like John Company you guys are talking about with the right people and the right time. And then, as it is right now, I'm just really enjoying 18xx games. And so I find myself wanting to hit the table with those a bit more. But War of the Ring, Battle of Five Armies, I mean, I have probably 2 or 3 good friends who we pretty regularly, probably once a month, will put one of these games on the table. And that's been for a number of years now. So
good to get a window into your mind here. So maybe TC will already just use some of this stuff, but we'll do a little bit of an official. We'll do an official start now.
All right.
Sounds good.
3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to the Longview Podcast, in which we take a closer look at the games people play. Today's game of the day is a sequel of sorts, but a prequel of sorts to one of the greatest epics ever written. And its game originally came out from the Tolkien Lord of the Rings trilogy. The War of the Ring is an excellent episode of the Longview, but that is in the past, and the present is the past as well, as I was saying, because we are going to be focusing on The Hobbit and its board game, The Battle of Five Armies. Today, to take us on that journey, which is, if you've ever seen the old cartoon Hobbit, the greatest adventure is what. Oh yeah, we all seen that like 150 times. Yeah. All right. He's gonna take us on this greatest adventure, and he is Luke. Luke, welcome to the Longview.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Luke, I'm really excited to hear this because you come at this from an angle of a gamer who appreciates. Maybe we'll call them gaming hats, being able to enjoy an experience for for a story that you get from it, being able to enjoy a game for company, being able to enjoy a math homework assignment. I mean, 18xx game.
You always got to get a dig on those ones, hey?
Like I said, the prod, man, I'm getting out the prod already. So we're going to do further analysis of as the episode goes on. That's total sarcasm there, man. I think that your perspective is something that will be very interesting, and I hope that as a host I can help to get to the core of that. But you've already done such an awesome job with us in a bit of the pre-podcast comments, so I'm really excited to hear your perspective. And also joined by my co-host here on the Longview, partner in crime, TC Reed. How are you doing, TC?
It's fine. I thought we was going to be talking about Deadly Premonition. We're talking about classic games. I'm a little disappointed. We're going to be talking about some book that was written a long time ago. That's a Lord of the something or other. But we got Luke on here. We'll let him have his due. It's all good, right,
TC? TC is still stuck in the upside down, and the only contact he has with the real world is this audio line that still somehow works. So
it's sad. It's been a rough few weeks for me. Everything's been a little crazy, but I'm here from the other side. I'm appreciative. I'm having touch with other human beings at this point. It's nice, a nice change of pace here.
Well, it's great to have you on, TC. Thanks for joining. And Luke, I would just like to turn this over to you to begin with wherever you'd like to start with this. Of course, about the Battle of Five Armies for folks that maybe have never seen nor heard of it. Like we were talking about earlier, sometimes it's enjoyable to listen to a Longview as your first experience with the game. So I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Sounds
sir.
good. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. And you sort of alluded to gaming hats. And I thought I'd just start there to give people sort of a bit of a context to understand why I like Battle of Five Armies before actually digging into it. I think, as you mentioned, I have been drawn towards 18xx games lately. I enjoy sort of mid-weight, heavy Euros. I enjoy some of these, what you'd call thematic games. Although I hesitate to call Battle of Five Armies and War of the Ring thematic games. You know, I'll tell you a little story. I was playing Eldritch Horror, I think. It was a number of years ago. And I remember saying to myself as I was playing that I just want this to stop. I hate this so much. And I remember really wanting to get sucked into that narrative of what was happening. And I was enjoying my company, but there was something about the card draws and sort of the story that, I don't know, was emerging that just wasn't as engaging as perhaps maybe what I find with War of the Ring or Battle of Five Armies, where the story itself is already set, that I sort of participate in it and create it new as I'm going along. So I don't know, I found a little bit of a difference between the way some of these games play out and certain other thematic games. It's such a broad category, it's hard to say.
Yeah, it is. When a certain game gets categorized as thematic and everybody embraces it, it makes you kind of think like, well, I don't like that game, so do I like thematic games?
But I think there's quite a bit of diversity within what we consider thematic, just as what we consider Euro, etc. Right?
Yeah, labels are just that. They're nothing more. So we're talking about a game here, though, that, you know, even if you don't like, you know, quote unquote thematic games, you're coming at this from like, this is a game that's like a classic with wide appeal.
And to be honest, I also encountered it fairly early in my gaming, and so I think those games tend to have a bit more of a connection with you. They resonate with you, especially something as epic as War of the Ring, which is one of those early games. I think it just sort of, you know, set my mind for understanding how broad and how incredible a game can be in terms of that epic scale, right? I hadn't encountered that previously. The long view itself, I think, introduced me to so many games as well. I've been exposed to so many titles that you'd see on my shelf. That does for great listening. But I know back in the day, like listening to games that I hadn't heard about before, this was always an inspiring platform for me to go check something out. And so I think I also want to do a little bit of justice to Battle of Five Armies, especially as I think it tends to sit in sort of the shadow of War of the Ring a little bit.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I thought, man, Battle of Five Armies, that's one that doesn't get enough attention. And
it kind of came, and people were like, from what I could tell, they kind of gravitated back toward War of the Ring. And I was always curious it was like, okay, what happened here?
Well, thanks for that plug for the long view. I mean, I come at it from that exact same angle as you, Luke. I've been sitting in the hosting chair for, you know, not even long enough to feel like I'm not a guest anymore. Like TC, you're more the long view than I am, dude. It's but it really is that same passion for you know, getting into a game and really getting into it, you know, like really understanding what makes it work and what you come into it for, you know, like what sort of mindset you go into with the game. It's something that the long view kind of started, and I feel like ever since then there's been very few games that people have you know, a really strong audience with lots of support that people can enumerate the reasons they like a game. And I feel like almost every single one of those is, you know, a game that I can appreciate at least for something.
Well, I'm always glad to give people a platform to talk about the games they enjoy. That's the biggest impetus for me. I love just sitting back and listening to people to talk about games they really, really enjoy. And that's the biggest reason why I decided to take this shindig over with you, Joe. Just bringing people in and just listen to them talk about the games they enjoy. Even if something I don't like, just listening to their passion is like, oh, you know, I may not like the game, but I sure like listening to you talk about it.
And I thought you were on the way to my heart. So, Luke, what about the Battle of Five Armies? What did you pre-order this one due to your interest in War of the Ring?
Well, that's interesting, actually, because I bought War of the Ring right when the second edition came out, which I'm trying to remember when that would have been. Maybe 09, 10, something like that.
Is that when Ares got it back?
Yeah, maybe it was a little bit later even. Maybe it was 2011 or 2012. Anyway, I got that pretty immediately when I knew there was this second edition. And then I heard rumors of Battle of Five Armies. I tracked with it a little bit. and I'm trying to place it. I think it's 2014 is the publication of Battle of Five Armies, and I also want to connect this to the Hobbit movies. When did the Hobbit movies come out?
Oh, right about that time, wasn't it?
Right about that time too. Sorry, and I don't want to show my cards too much, but I just remember being really bored with the Hobbit movies.
Yes, they really are.
They just are a little bit too much CGI glut going on, and a bit of a loss of character and narrative and that sort of a thing. And I don't know if that tainted my interest in the Battle of Five Armies as a game, but I remember not pursuing it at the time. And then I saw it in my local gaming store, and I think it might have been around, I want to even say it might have been like a Christmas Eve sale. And I'm like, I'm going to get it, you know? And I just sort of bought it on a whim, actually. And I'm really glad I did, because it's quite a fantastic game. And I will be honest, if you had sort of a negative reaction to the Hobbit movies, specifically that last Battle of the Five Armies movie, I actually feel this game is a redemptive element to that.
Wow.
That's high praise. And I think that you really captured something. You know, this is based on the IP at its core. This is based on the J.R.R. Tolkien novel, and not necessarily that movie, which I 100% agree with you, Luke. There was a lot of filler and a lot of CGI because they wanted to stretch it into so many different movies. And, you know, hilariously enough, this whole epic battle that was supposed to happen just kind of felt like I was desensitized entirely by the time that it came to be.
Well, there's a loss of tension that happened in the movie for me, and something that I find while playing this game is this like building tension. And there's something neat about that, right?
Yes.
Like, we're talking about the exact same experience from that book, that same chapter, but it's represented in this medium, I think, in a much better way than it is on film.
Certainly.
Wow.
I think you're right. Like, you were searching to appreciate a you know, like art, some other form of art that was the same, you know, like doing justice to this story that we both love. I'm right there with you, man. Like, it's been close to my heart as well. Unfortunately, I have to defer to my brother because he's the expert. Like, he has that Tolkien encyclopedia, and he can like quote the unfinished tales.
Wow.
But if not for that, I would have thought that I was like, you know, one of the biggest Tolkien fans. And it sounds like, Luke, like we're right here, you know, among friends. So I totally get where you're going with that. And this is redemptive in my eyes too. And I never considered that.
Well, it might be a bit of a stretch to use that word, but yeah. I guess I could also situate Battle of Five Armies within the Ares line of games that all have to do with the Lord of the Rings, like this IP, if that's helpful. Battle of Five Armies really, the system that is used in this game, which I'll talk about in a minute here, is an evolution of a system that was used as an expansion for the first edition of War of the Ring, which was called Battles of the Third Age. This was an expansion by Fantasy Flight Games when Fantasy Flight owned the IP, and they produced the first edition. They also produced this expansion, which has now been expanded upon. Essentially, it was an expansion that was broken into 3 segments, from my understanding, by the designers, and they're re-implementing each of these 3 segments as separate expansions for the second edition. 2 of those are already published, and the third one is one of those things that's in limbo, and yeah, I'm sure it'll be published in a number of years here. And within that expansion box, the Battles of the Third Age were actually 2 standalone games that were the genesis of this system. There was the Battle of Helm's Deep and the Battle of Minas Tirith, and it was actually separate boards. It had the exact same look in a sense, and the same sort of mechanics that's going on with Battle of Five Armies. It operated differently than War of the Ring, and they were separate games, and it was sort of, I think the expansion was a vessel to package those in. I wouldn't be any expert in that, but that's sort of the genesis of the system. And my understanding is the designers came back to this later on and said, well, let's use this system. Let's, again, evolve it a little bit more and re-implement it for the Battle of Five Armies, which is along the same kind of lines as the Battle of Helm's Deep or Minas Tirith, a focused sort of effort.
Wow. I had no idea that it had a lineage, is almost like, you know, this little appendage of the War of the Ring that ended up now getting developed into the entirety that is like, you know, a big box on par size-wise with the actual War of the Ring second edition.
Yeah, and I actually reached out to Roberto, who's one of the designers of this game, and just asked him a few of these questions about, again, origins and you know, how the design came to be. And I'll just read you a few things here. This was in an email conversation. I think it's kind of an interesting insight into it. He and Francisco and Marco, he said, is the design team of War of the Ring. They'd been discussing the idea of a Hobbit-based prequel to the War of the Ring for a long time, and this is again how this evolution came about. They said they wanted an adventure game that had little or nothing to do with War of the Ring, a strategy game that you know, had its source material in The Hobbit, which was another book that they'd really appreciated. And these guys, if you follow them on Board Game Geek, or if you run into them in other podcasts, they have a deep appreciation of the source material, as we've been talking about here, Joe. And I think that's something that also drew me towards this game, is that I know that these designers have taken an incredible amount of care and sort of respect for the actual work that Tolkien has produced as a story, as narrative elements, as emotional connecting pieces, which is something, again, that I think The Hobbit didn't do a great job at doing, right? There's kind of a disrespect I've often thought about in that.
Like a commercialization, more of a profit. How do we monetize this?
For this episode, you contacted the designers to talk about the game?
Yeah, why not?
Anytime you want to come back is fantastic. That is, like, you've done the most homework for this podcast that even I have done. That's incredible.
Well, you know what I found? I mean, the board game community is, I think, small enough still that people are designers or gamers or publishers. I think people genuinely love when they're asked about their work, right? Like, you guys as content providers here, as you know, people who have put themselves out there. I mean, I'm sure you appreciate emails that you get, and I imagine the same is true for most designers who are putting these games out. So I always feel like it's worth an ask, right?
Yeah, my favorite thing is when the Nigerian prince is like, "I love your podcast." No, you're totally, you nailed it there, Luke. It's one of those things that just, you know, it's hard for me to like shut my brain down and go to sleep at the end of a night in which I've had such an engaging discussion. And a lot of times that just isn't necessarily something where we're sitting down to record an episode. It'll just be somebody sent me an email after of reactions to an episode, or you know, just something entirely disconnected, you know, letting me know about something really interesting going on with a game that, you know, has nothing to do with any of the stuff that I make. So I'm totally right there with you, man. It's a community that you can reach out, and people are, this is their passion. This is what they love doing. But good job on your homework, man. That is, like, I want to echo what TC says. I'm thrilled. And I want to, you know, I don't want to make my blathering, you know, interrupt where you were going with.
No. And you know what? I'll integrate a few more things that he sent me here. I guess the one thing I'll end on from this section of the email, he was just saying, you know, those battle games that they developed for War of the Ring based on Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith there were just this obvious starting point, and they just had considered coming back to it and, you know, built this game around that. And he also did mention that I sort of prodded also, right? You're in conversation. You may as well prod. I'm like, hey, are you ever going to come back to Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith? And he said, well, we'll hope that'll happen too soon, not in the too far future. So that's one of those things I would love to look forward to, is more games within this system that operate a little bit differently, maybe.
Yeah, there's a lot of different sort of places you could zoom into. Whereas the War of the Ring is, you know, it's everything, the entire trilogy. Each of these different conflicts can really be handled if, you know, each of them has aspects that are, you know, canon material that are enough to create an entire sort of, you know, love letter to that specific scene. Yeah. So getting back to how this fits within the Ares line, they got the rights, I guess, for War of the Ring and produced it with the second edition. And then this is sort of the second game within that line, the War of the Ring line, I think they call it, Battle of Five Armies. It sounds like there's possibility for more games that are similar like this, you know, within the Lord of the Rings universe. And Hunt for the Ring, which we'd mentioned prior to the show here, is the third game within that line. And that focuses on, you know, that specific couple chapters at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, with the hobbits sort of, you know, leaving Hobbiton and trying to get to Rivendell. And I actually haven't received that game or played it, so I don't have anything else I can really comment on that, but I'm eagerly anticipating getting it in the door here. As we mentioned, just a little snapshot that can be made into an entire game. And I thought it looked like the mechanisms were really cool, though I didn't get a chance to play it myself.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I can continue and let's talk about the game itself. What's the actual story? If people are unfamiliar with Battle of Five Armies, I'm assuming some listeners maybe are. Although I'd say the movies have made Lord of the Rings pretty ubiquitous in our cultural mindset. But essentially, this game is sort of living recreation of the final chapter of the Book of the Hobbit, right? There's this, and to be honest, if you read the last chapter of the Book of the Hobbit, you'll realize there's not actually that much descriptive detail about what's going on in the battle. You know, it's a centerpiece for following the rest of the story, and it's sort of a capstone to the story, but there's not much going on in terms of that actual chapter, whereas this game has details upon details that actually get you to sort of recreate this battle in a way that is much more, has much more depth than I think even the novel or perhaps even the movies offer.
Yeah, the novel, the last chapter is almost something you could sleep through.
Yeah.
like maybe what Bilbo did.
Exactly. I mean, so the essence of the context of this game is you've got a number of free people's armies, and this is what they call them in the context of the game. You've got elves and men from Lake Town, and you've got dwarves who are all, at the beginning of this battle, supposed to be in conflict with one another over the riches in the Lonely Mountain. And what happens at the same time is these hordes of goblins and orcs come streaming in, and these armies that were all in conflict decide to band together and fight these raging hordes. So that's kind of where the game picks up, right in the midst of that, where you have this massive army of what they call the shadow forces that are going to be streaming in on the board. And so one player is going to take the shadow armies, and essentially their goal is to march across and capture some of these. It's a bit of an area control element. There's different strongholds and settlements which are worth victory points, and the Shadow's goal is to capture 10 victory points and hold it at the end of a turn. If that's done, then they've won the game. The Free Peoples, who are a much more scattered and ragtag sort of team in this game, their goal is either to hang on till the bitter end. And there's a little mechanism that I'll talk about later called the fate track, which is something that sort of represents the growing fate of the Free People's sort of, I don't know, banding together. And there's all these sorts of heroes and characters that interplay as that fate marker moves along. And slowly, if the Free People are able to hold on, they will win the game that way. Alternatively, the Free People can win the game by eliminating Bolg, who's sort of this leading character for the Shadow Forces, and I'll talk a little bit about why I think that's an interesting mechanism as well. But yeah, that's the essence to the theme.
Absolutely, I think you've done a great job of putting this where it sits in terms of, it is an area control game mechanically, but the different forces each sort of have their, what I would call, like, I feel like they deserve theme music. These little miniatures that for this WrestleMania game, Middle Earth, and I think though that that's an idea. The evil people are looking to sort of eventually there are different ways you can go, but you're wanting to hold spots and just get that turf and hold it, whereas the good people kind of just want to hold on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite asymmetric in that way. And I'm sure that's a word that we will say a number of times, because both this and War of the Ring thrive on asymmetry. Yeah. And I find that quite interesting in a two-player game like this. A little bit more about the mechanics. It's essentially at the heart of it is this action dice system. And so what you're doing is you have dice with 6 different sort of possible actions that you can take, and you're rolling them during, like, at the beginning of your turn. And then you're playing sort of an I go, you go element where, you can play a face and take the action. And it's really simple to explain that way. And, I want to circle back to that. I'll just give an overview of the mechanics though. So action dice are sort of at the heart of driving what you can actually do. There are also quite a number of cards. They're called event cards and story cards. And I'd say both with this and War of the Ring, these games are as much a dice-driven action game. I mean, it's almost like a action point system, but it's a bit more determined by the die. But they're also equally, I'd say, a card game. because really these cards have such important influence over what strategy you're going to take for the turn, over what possible tactics you're going to employ. And if you're not playing the cards, you're probably going to lose the game. And if you're not playing them well, I should say, and knowing when exactly to implement them and when perhaps to take the risk to draw more, because you might stumble upon those things that you need to swing the tide of a battle or something like that.
Absolutely. And there's not just one use for many of the cards, right? They're
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, each of the cards is divided with the top and bottom half. The top half is usually what's called like a story or event element, which is played by using one of those action dice. And the bottom of the card is a combat effect, which is used when you sort of zoom in and you have a combat situation. And it's one of those, again, those tensions that you have to play with in terms of the card game dynamic of saying, well, do I want to use this earlier for sort of my larger strategy within the turn, or do I want to hold onto it as a sort of tactical opportunity within the context of a battle? I find that kind of possibilities within the cards just a very interesting thing.
Sure, yeah, and it's also a way they just take that baster and just take the theme and right into the game, right? That's where you get a lot of the events that actually happen, in the battle. So the coming of the different characters. Regarding asymmetry, you've already mentioned, you said we were going to say this 100 times. So, we're going to make this into a little bit of a drinking game as well. It's every time you hear asymmetry, there you go. It's not, you mentioned the action dice, and even those are not symmetrical. They share a lot of the same things, but there's the good dice is different from the evil players, the shadow players dice.
Yeah. So the asymmetry really shows itself with the Free People's dice have, I think it's 2 sides that include the character symbol. So there's much more emphasis, sort of broadly speaking, on characters for the Free People in this. Characters, heroes, whatever you want to call them, are essential to Free People victory. And they're employed really interestingly in this game because they have pretty powerful effects that you can use them for, whether it's sort of a side pseudo combat sort of effect that takes place outside of an actual official combat, or whether it's recruitment purposes or things like that. Characters are so essential for the Free Peoples. The Shadow only has one character, and that's their sort of like their hero, and can be used powerfully in battles. But the Shadow Force, their dice have more sides that have to do with army recruitment or army movement, because what's going on is they are playing a highly logistical game, right? They've got a mass of forces up in the sort of northeast corner of the board, but it takes a lot of effort to move those forces into the positions that you need them for striking at some of these strongholds and settlements. And, it kind of reminds me of these sort of supply line situations with some war games where it's like, well, if you've sent these guys out and you didn't have sort of a backup plan to support them with a second army or something like that, you can really shoot yourself in the foot as the Shadow Army. It's very logistical for them, I would say.
And I would agree 100%. It even, you're also managing like so many forces. It really is, though, you need to be everywhere in all the right spots with all of the guys. I feel like there's not enough miniatures in the box for how much that Shadow Army needs to really be able to withstand all the onslaught and just the buildup that you're going to see from the good players.
Well, and one of those elements of asymmetry that I love about that dynamic of having so many forces at the beginning for the Shadow is you sort of feel this confidence as a player, and you just feel like, I'm going to go trample over these Free People's armies. and so you can take these risky maneuvers, and you realize that was too much risk often. But, you're sending these guys out because you just feel like, well, I'll easily wipe these things out. I mean, they're piddly little armies of 2 or 3 little dudes, and I've got a massive army of, whatever. And you realize that all those Free People's characters and the way the Free Peoples end up using their event cards and the way they just keep picking away at your armies if you leave them isolated and a little bit too far out. Oh man. Yeah. It's the tension mounts, I'd say, more for the Shadow player in some ways in this game than it does for the Free Peoples, because you're pushing the clock as the Shadow player. You want to get this game done as soon as possible, because every minute that you let it go by, every time that fate marker moves up the track, you see new Free People's heroes entering play that you fear. Yeah.
Wow. It is really scary. It is. Every time one of them comes out, it's like, that's the smallest miniature in the game. Ooh. He's way worse than I expected.
Mm-hmm.
Bilbo woke up.
No.
Yeah, no, it's quite a delicious little thing that they've baked into the game there.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that, you know, the outlay, you've got to really be in tune as a shadow player to the contours of the map as well. And I think that the ball is in your court. The impetus is on the shadow player to win this game. The good player kind of has that sort of catch-all, you know, if the game gets to this point, the good player wins victory, whereas a shadow player is like, you've got to be out there and you got to be finding a way to get that turf and hold that turf.
Which, for the free peoples, it doesn't mean you can just turtle and play defense either, though. And I have found that in the number of plays that I've had, that the free peoples need to know when to make these sort of tactical strikes. These strikes that will weaken those armies that the shadow player is risked by putting out there on a limb, right? And it's about seizing little opportunities, I find, in this game more than anything. You can't just play one simple strategy of saying, hey, I'm gonna, you know, hole up and hope I'm gonna defend, because the shadow army can take their time and maneuver then, right? What you really want to do is you want to poke and prod that beast as the free peoples and make them make like suboptimal moves and put them in positions where you're going to just, like, you know, cut a few bloody wounds and watch that bleed out, because eventually you're going to have the opportunity to make that final strike and probably wipe out one of those armies for good. Which then puts the shadow in a position where they have to play this giant logistics game to get these armies back in.
It really is, because it is so tough to get from the shadow players' mustering points are so remote that really they have to make the right calls of where to place those units. And as a good player, to kind of reference this with something a little bit information is dangerous in my hands, but Dan Carlin's Hardcore Histories mentioned that, like, in World War I, there were these, like, sort of fighting retreats. And I feel like that's a lot of what the good player is trying to do, almost fight like a bit of a guerrilla battle, like you've mentioned, while the evil player is more looking to sort of isolate and exterminate.
Yeah, I guess that's asymmetry, similar to, like, coin games, right? Like, there's often different factions that play quite differently. Yeah, absolutely. So besides those mechanics, the action dice and the cards, which I think are two of the key elements for driving the game, what we talked about area control. The shadow, again, need to push and take a certain number of victory points. Combat is sort of the other, of course, the heart, the other heart of this game. And within a combat situation, we've got rolling dice, and this is, maybe we can have sort of a little side conversation here about this, but, you know, it's a pretty basic die rolling system. Like, you're rolling one dice for each unit that you have involved in that combat, and you're hitting on 5s and 6s in most cases. There's some modifiers based on geography. Sometimes a stronghold will, you know, bump that up to a 6 as the target number, or certain combat cards are going to change those things. But essentially, you're looking for hits on your units on 5s or 6s. Now, what's different about this combat system than War of the Ring, if I can go there right now, is the fact that they've introduced a damage system. And so in War of the Ring, what happened is when you got a hit, the unit was just removed from play. Like, it was immediately after that round of combat, and then you can, you know, each subsequent round of combat, you're just removing units until one army's sort of extinguished or one army retreats or that sort of a thing. There's a fair bit more complexity involved in the battles in this game. And part of it's due to these damage markers, which I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with. I think it creates interesting strategic points for you as a person involved in combat, deciding when to retreat. Because what happens is for each hit, you're applying a little token. It's a little triangular token that you sort of stick next to the army. And what happens is when those tokens are greater than the number of units, then you have to start removing a unit. And every unit that you remove removes 2 of those tokens. And so there's kind of this threshold of damage that an army can take. And my opponent and I, when we play this, we often talk, it's like this growing waterfall that's just, or this dam that's going to burst forward, because if you have like 5 damage on 5 units, you know that if you take, if you get in another combat round and you take like 3 hits, that army is decimated, right? And so you kind of got to decide, when am I going to stop pushing? But at the same time, if you could potentially take out that other army, sometimes it's worth the risk. Now, the way that these damage markers are interesting, I think, is once you're done a combat round, there are actions you can take to remove these damage markers by what's called rallying your troops. And so you can often put these armies out there with a fair bit of damage with the hope that as long as they survive, there's potentially ways I can get them back to this full force and they can be just as threatening as they were at the beginning.
Yeah, it does add, like, you feel like you've got nothing to lose when you've got a totally healed unit, but then as soon as you start taking damage, it quickly becomes like, I'm in retreat mode now.
Exactly. And I think that's the situation the shadow player can end up in, because a lot of these Free People's events and characters, like I said, when they're adding little bits of damage, often through an archery attack, or Gandalf has this special magic blaster, just things like that. And you're usually not, as the Free People's, worried about taking out the army in those cases. You're like, hey, I'm going to apply 2-3 damage on you, because then when I attack you with my smaller force, all of a sudden you're not as threatening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really interesting. That's definitely something that the system adds that can make it so, the bigger they are, the harder they fall sort of mentality, where the evil player can have this gigantic murder ball, but if it just gets pinged, it might still look scary in the mid game, but it's a glass cannon.
Absolutely. That's a great way of framing it. Yeah. The hate relationship I have with these things is it's just incredibly fiddly. I don't know if you remember playing this, Joe, but like these little damage tokens, these triangle. Yeah.
Board.
So they all look the same as well. It's regardless of which army they're attached to, and they're triangular. So we've adopted this thing where you sort of point them at the army that they're attached to, right? And so now if your army moves around the board, you got to move this like stack of 3-4 tokens with it. And I find that fiddliness is just one of those compromises that I guess you have to make for adding that extra element, but it's worth a mention. Within combat as well, cards play such a key role in this, even more so than in War of the Ring. Again, I'll mention War of the Ring first. It had the same sort of dual purpose event cards, and so when you're in a combat situation, you play a combat card that either lowers your target number or raises your opponent's target number or does some additional damage or things like that. In this game, there are specific unit combat cards that are connected to the actual figures that you have involved in battle. And so no longer do you have just here's a horde of orcs and goblins and wargs and whatever, and it doesn't matter, they're all the same. Actually, each different unit has a different ability, which is really quite a bit of fun. And so at the beginning of each round, depending on the, who's in your little army, you can play one of those combat cards, and usually it's a unique little effect that you're going to get. Similar to the combat card effects, but I think often a little bit more powerful. Although it's not a guarantee in this case. When you're playing one of those unit combat cards, you're hoping when you roll a dice that dice itself is a hit from that particular unit, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I remember that system very well, and I really enjoyed that because at the start of every round, you're looking at these cards and deciding, what's going to be the best tactical choice, and it does add this element of like, what's he going to play? What is that unit's special abilities, and how can I either deal with that or take advantage of that? And, the game comes with black dice and white dice, so that way you can know, like, well, I'm rolling, before you roll, it's generally like the black dice is usually what you use to, for the units that are going to hit with your special abilities. And I thought that was a really interesting system. It's not the only cards you have in your hand, though, because like you're going to be playing a card every single round. Like you mentioned, the cards are a much bigger deal here during combat. They're much a larger part of combat. In War of the Ring, as I recall, like most rounds of combat did not involve cards unless you like specifically wanted to play them.
Yeah, and I found in War of the Ring, the use of a card during a combat seems like a real big loss because those cards have such diverse effects within the rest of the game, right?
It's almost like the way, like, the story event is like something that you could take 5 turns to, epically drop down Treebeard and Isengard, or you can play it for a +2 to your dice roll.
Exactly.
What am I going to go with? There's no choice there. Of course I'm going Treebeard. Like, no. But here, like, the effects are very impactful of the combat cards, and having them in your hand is definitely useful. And you can never tell if somebody's played a stronger other combat card that you don't even know, because these like you said are multi-use cards are just in their hands. You never know if it's going to be one of those, or if it's going to be a combat card that ties to a specific unit, like you said.
Yeah, I find those decisions, particularly when you're thinking about which army to attack. You're saying, oh, that one has some veteran dwarves. I don't know if I really want to get involved with that battle, because I know how bad that can end up if those guys hit.
Yeah, they do like the double. Yeah, and there's so many different units, and really the diversity of the actual units in this game are one more thing that just blows it out of the water combat wise compared to War of the Ring. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I found myself in War of the Ring, I mean, caring whether you had an elite or a regular. I think those are the two distinctions, right? But besides that, it didn't matter if they were from, Gondor or Rohan or elves. It didn't really matter. They all did the same function. Other than perhaps, no, I think they all just had this function. Whereas in this game, every single unit matters. And so the diversity of what you have in your army could make the difference in the battle. And I found sometimes when I'm actually, more particularly as the shadow player, deciding how I'm going to craft a particular army as I move them across the board, I'm going to say, well, do I want all orcs in here? Because I know I will, if I'm going to get their combat ability, I'll probably likely hit, or should I have a bit more diversity so I'll have more opportunity to have these, stronger effects?
Composing your army is
yes.
much. Yeah. That's why I sucked at this game, because
I didn't make armies.
Yeah, maybe the battle was already won before I ever started it.
Yeah.
Or lost, I should say, won by my opponents.
Well, and what should be noted is when you use a unit's combat card, you can't use it again until you play, I think it's called a regroup card, and then you can pick it back up. So you're essentially forfeiting a round of combat effects, right? Combat bonuses, in order to get that bonus back. And so that's where the diversity within a unit can actually be really advantageous, because you could play 2 or 3 in a row before needing to pick them all back up round to round.
Yeah, and that regroup card has it's not just to get your cards back, it's also how you sort of tap out. Yeah,
I mean, again, this differs a little bit from the War of the Ring combat, but this game differentiates between retreating and routing. And so if you retreat, there's no penalty other than playing that regroup card. That's the thing you have to do in order to actually accept the retreat. If you're going to run away, otherwise it's called a rout. And essentially what happens is that the defending or attacking army gets another shot at you. And that can be really painful.
Yeah, getting routed is never a good thing.
No.
So I think you've done a great job, so far, of just the cards are everywhere in this combat system, absolutely everywhere, and that's what I think is very different for players that are familiar with War of the Ring.
No, absolutely, and I think, like you've mentioned as well, the cards themselves are, like, because everything is much more focused than in War of the Ring. Like in War of the Ring, you might have 3 or 4 levels of things going on. You're thinking, oh, I got to move my fellowship. That's a whole section of my brain and my strategy that I need to devote. And you might say, I'm going to keep these cards for that strategy, and you almost it's one of those things where you want to turn it down on the table, say that's designated for that job. And then you've got some of the defense mechanisms and the attack stuff in War of the Ring. Here everything is about movement and attack, and it's just such a more focused game in that sense. And so I find it plays very differently, and so each of those cards is, I would say, equally valuable in setting me up tactically during the turn to, make my dice more valuable or have a little bit more powerful recruitment ability, or it's probably equally valuable within the combat situation.
Yeah, these cards really become a tough decision point in whereas you've got everything really kind of tied towards everything is useful, I feel like, in Battle of Five Armies, and everything is sort of tied to this focused, like you said, the idea that the good players are they have a goal in mind. Whereas, you really do end up with, in the War of the Ring, with sort of okay, I'm misdirecting in this direction and my armies are over here, and I'm trying to just, make sure that they get held out, try to get as many economic bonuses as I can, maybe, maybe go for that weird and bizarre, but I've heard that it's happened, the good player winning on a military side, with military alone in War of the Ring. There's no like, there's no sort of divided brain power here in Battle of Five Armies.
Yeah, it's a much more sort of singular effort for both sides, which doesn't mean that it's less interesting. I think I actually find the tensions equally entertaining. And we should talk a little bit about the free peoples, I think, and maybe we can bridge this conversation into a bit of the characters, because I think that's quite an interesting element of this game. So I'll frame this by saying at the beginning of each turn, what happens is that, you draw cards, so you sort of have a regular card flow coming in, and then there's this whole section prior to rolling the action dice that has a lot to do with characters. And so the first thing that happens is the free people get to essentially designate or activate. Yeah, it's activate generals. And so at the beginning of the game, they have a number of generals on the board which have these important effects, such as recruitment. There's, in fact, I don't think there is, besides the action cards or these story cards, another mechanical way to actually recruit units as the free people, other than through these generals. But the tension is you have to decide how many of these guys am I going to activate? Because if the number I activate, the shadow player is going to get to draw that number of fate tiles and discard any ones that they don't want along the way. So in other words, the shadow really wants the game to go as slow as possible, right? Because they want the game to end for them as quickly as possible. So they want the fate to progress slowly. So if you as a free people are activating all of your generals, essentially giving yourself as much opportunity, as much power as you can within that turn, the shadow is able to respond by having 3 opportunities to draw tiles. And in a sense, it's, again, this asymmetric, intertwined element of this game.
Absolutely. And to compare that back to War of the Ring, it was more like the game timer was the fellowship, and it was basically just that. It was mostly a game timer, and the rest of it was largely a distraction, because the game sort of enters into different, what I would call maybe eras. And here in the Battle of Five Armies, that game timer precisely is tied precisely to one of the goals, and it just, like you said, makes it much more of this connects to this, whereas this is supposed to represent this while this is going on over here.
Yep, exactly. A little bit more about the characters, I guess. There are these initial characters that have a lot of these recruitment effects, and specifically Gandalf, and I think it's King Thranduil. I never really know how to say that guy's name. Anyway, yeah, well, you try. Just Google it and give it a shot. But both those characters, if you activate them, can actually use these sort of, what I called them before, pseudo combat effects. Essentially, they get to take pot shots either by, rallying some archers together, or Gandalf fires his magic blast, which, by the way, if you haven't seen it, is by far the coolest piece in this game. It's this little cardboard. It's this little cardboard like arch
ruler, right?
It's like a range ruler essentially, and it's like this physical component that determines how far the reach of Gandalf's magic blast goes. It's just kind of out of the ordinary, but it's really quite fun. And really what you end up doing with Gandalf, at least what we've ended up doing, is trying to position him in a place where he has like sort of the most opportunity to take these pot shots at some of those shadow armies coming by. The other characters that enter play, such as Bilbo or Thorin, the Eagles, and then Beorn near the end of the game, each have, I'd say, sort of increasingly powerful effects that they get to employ. And all these things, again, effects are all combat related, since this game is just a focused effort on combat. Bilbo provides this sort of defensive buffering. Thorin really beefs up some recruitment and makes the front gate, which is one of the key strongholds in the game, a bit of a beast to try to attempt to take as the shadow player.
Yeah, he sits there.
Yeah, it's like when he enters play, the shadow player almost wants to wipe their hands of attempting that one.
The king under the mountain is there. He's already gone.
Exactly. And what's interesting about this game, I think, is you have the shadow goal is to get 10 victory points, but there's 20 possible victory points on the board. And so, you start to see the ebb and flow of the current of the game, depending on what choices players are making in terms of which direction they're going with that area control.
Yeah, you're not gonna you're not going to be able to get all of these spots. The good player is going to be, going to make certain spots just inefficient for you to really try to attack, but you don't need all of them.
No, exactly. What's interesting about the board actually is some of these locations look so far away, like Ravenhill, which is in the southwest corner of the board, feels like I'm never going to get there as the shadow player. And prior to recording here, I think today, I just was like, again, remembering and counting out the spaces, and it's no further than the front gate. Like things on the board aren't what they appear.
Mm-hmm. It has one of those really snaky, like you've got to be able to see where the adjacencies between regions lie. And you can tell that there's an intentionality to that, to make it so that an area is not just so remote and difficult for the new players to take. It does, though, feel kind of like you're hitting them where it counts, though, because that's like right next to your elves muster points, if I'm not mistaken.
It is, yeah. It kind of reminds me of Kemet in that sense, how that board is designed with a lot of equality in terms of where you're positioned. I do find this board is one of those things that requires just a little bit of study as the shadow player, especially because, I was mentioning it's a bit of a logistic games for them. It's good for them to just get a sense of like, okay, even just counting out the number of regions it takes to get to some of these key strongholds or locations. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that, your different characters are going to be, each of them has like its own separate entire like placard that goes in front of you. Like it's like a mega sized card.
Yeah, it is a mega sized card. And it has on one side the requirements for them to interplay, and on the other side their effects during the game, essentially. And since we're on the topic of those giant cards, the art in this game is fantastic. If you're a fan of Tolkien, of that universe, I feel like War of the Ring, Battle of Five Armies, and from what I've seen from Hunt for the Ring, all just do such a fantastic job of capturing, I think, the spirit of Tolkien's world, but not sort of being kitsch or mimicking what already exists necessarily. Like it definitely doesn't look like it's movie art. Or based on that, it sort of has its own original feel to it. And I think that's quite a neat thing that the design team made efforts to include. It makes these games feel like they stand on their own a little bit.
For sure. I think that, that you've got like marbled dice for your action dice. The production's amazing. The actual game box itself was award-winning outside of the board gaming industry even. It won, and I would agree with that. If we had all these fantasy races, I would imagine the box of Five Armies to be on display in that fantasy world's equivalent of the Prado Museum.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a fantastic cover. And I mean, on each of these giant placards, like you're saying here, Joe, is a wonderfully illustrated picture of those characters and those heroes. And it's just one of those extra elements to immerse you within the story of the game, right?
Yeah, and it does a really great job of that. So the different effects that these units can have, it's not only is it tied to one of the most important things that the good player has to worry about, which is actually getting your units out onto the board, and that's where your main abilities to muster are. Like you mentioned, the shadow player is going to be able to do that because they just have the dice advantage for doing that. But the good player actually has a specific, their character abilities is like tied to their action dice, which just all, it gives you a vast variety of choices as the good player. Are you going to be using the character face of your die to activate this unit, and they're not units, they're characters. And they are much like you said, they are just very rich, very well portrayed. To refer to another game recently that's come out that's done this, you feel like these are personalities that are actually, these are the agents that are furthering the narrative of your game. And it reminds me a lot of like the Three Kingdoms Redux generals, where every general has a card with that artwork and has a token that represents specifically them. Now here we get miniatures, kind of a different audience, right? But that same sort of function of like, I feel like when I am choosing to use this, it is Gandalf firing a magical bolt. And I've even got the little cardboard, arc to be able to put out there. So totally with you there. I mean, when the characters themselves are going to just kind of like make that good player slowly stronger and stronger. Now, what do you do to counteract that as a shadow player?
In the game quicker? That's what I hear.
That
you already lost at that point? going?
You know what? It's quite interesting. I've had a number of games, and I think I've played, last I checked, 15 or 16 games of Battle of Five Armies here.
It's a good chunk. It's not a short, not exactly a small game by any means. It says like an hour on the box, 60 to 90.
We had one game go an hour, and that was we had to play back to back because you felt like you got robbed, and I think I lost, and I felt so punished that I had to get a second game in.
So if it actually lasts an hour, which is possible, okay, I stand corrected.
Yes, it is possible, but it's for one person it's going to be glorious, for the other it's going to be horrific. So yeah, I mean, probably the average time for this game sits around, for an experienced player, whatever you want to consider that, probably the 2 to 2.5 hours is my guess, which probably sits just, the half-hour margin below, half hour to an hour below War of the Ring.
Yeah.
Like my partner and I, when we play War of the Ring, we're knocking that thing off in 2.5 hours usually now, just because we've played it so many times. But I know for, if you play that every once in a while, it's probably more of the 3 to 4 hour type of game. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it took a little while for my game. I just 60 just seemed really difficult to achieve. But but yeah, within the realm of reason. So as the game continues to progress, though, the good player just keeps on adding like yet another tool into what's already feels fairly dangerous to start with, in terms of like, there's some tricks. There's tricksy hobbitses in this game.
Yeah. So what I was going to say, sorry, I just slipped my mind there, is in one of our games, what happened was Beorn entered play and went on a rampage. And this is where it's one of those, again, asymmetric. We need that bell to ring every time we say this, right? But those asymmetric notions, moments in the game where you feel so powerful all of a sudden as the free peoples. And I think I had Beorn at that time, and he had already been strengthened, and I sort of went on a rampage with this character, and he died. And then you
lost Beorn?
Yeah, and then all of a sudden I was like, feeling even more vulnerable than I did just before he came into play. And you have to realize there is potential to lose these characters in this game, which is also quite interesting. Like when they're connected to armies, they can be eliminated. And it makes you, as the free peoples, want to be able to play a little bit safely, but at the same time maximize their potential for damage.
For sure. Yeah. Whenever you see a character tied to an army as the shadow player, it's like low-hanging fruit. It really is, because on their own, you can't touch them. They can kind of like, if they're just on their own and they're not yet in position, you can't do anything. You can't actually combat a single, there's a few exceptions to that. I believe, like, isn't Beorn by himself just, is he an army, or am I...
He is. In fact, he has to be by himself. He can't be attached to an army.
Yeah.
But he can also he can take damage just like an army, and that's the point where he can actually be eliminated by himself.
It's just all these different characters, though, by themselves have cool effects, but you really get the best benefit from them being in an army, and that is when they are most vulnerable. So really tough. It makes it more difficult for your decision-wise as that good player. So if you're showing a new player how to play this, would you give them the shadow player or the good player?
I would probably give them the free peoples, just because, first of all, I think it's probably going to be a little bit more fun if you're new to this game.
Yeah.
Because you've got just so many things going on. You have characters entering play. You feel like, you're the ragtag team that's going to sort of band together, and I find for that player it's probably a little bit more interesting and a little bit more enjoyable, whereas the shadow player drives the pace of the game. And if you're unfamiliar with how to play it, I think you can get yourself stuck in some really tight situations. You can I think sort of slow the pace down to a point where you, as the shadow, have allowed the free peoples to build up too much of a force, and you almost need to concede in some ways. But
yeah, it is at that point, like, if they've got Beorn out and you haven't at least got, a good, on your way towards that 10 victory points, I mean, because you're going to be getting hit, and you're probably going to be taking big hits, just by that one character alone. Like you said, he kind of jumps on and just comes out swinging. So I agree. And I think I would do the same thing. Even though the free peoples are more difficult to get your head entirely around, you've got all this sort of hidden information that as an experienced player playing against the Shadows player, I feel like I would just be constantly like, oh, hey, I've got this card effect on this card that's over here in front of me, and it says that what you just did was probably a dumb move because I'm going to totally kill you now. And I think that could happen quite a bit because the free peoples are the ones that really have all the special powers, whereas when the Shadow player is doing things, it's almost all trackable. It's all right there on the board. You can see what they have access to, and you can see sort of where they're going with things. Not everything. You've got some uncertainty in terms of what cards might be in their hand, but absolutely, like I would do the exact same thing, even though the Shadow player is much easier. The free peoples would just, it's the heart of what's interesting here. And honestly, my next sort of like, is there a balance here? What are your spreads here, Luke, with, Shadow player versus good player victories?
Well, it's interesting you say that because I would say the free peoples is more complex than the Shadow play, but I do find maybe the Shadow is more difficult. If that's a distinction I could make.
I agree, absolutely. Like, it's a hard game to play. Like, you have to almost anticipate everything that is going to happen, and where, you have to know sort of where these units are going to come out. You have to understand that, like, if you haven't taken, the King Under the Mountain, if you haven't taken that spot by the time that King Thranduil or whatever, is it Thorin? Thorin, right? It's Thorin. Thorin that comes out and just busts into the King Under the Mountain spot. If you haven't done it by then you really need to just kind of change your focus. Whereas, like, if you were a player that was sort of working towards that and didn't understand that, I feel like, there's just a lot of anticipation that is going to be made easier if you've already played as the free people when you're playing as the Shadow player.
Now, that being said, I think the spread of my games, the Shadow has won quite a number of times more than the free peoples. We've found the free peoples, and again, it's the pacing of the game, right? Like, if the Shadow moves quickly, and I think as we've gotten better, I would say both myself and my primary gaming partner in this game have probably honed our skill with the Shadow more than we have with the free peoples. I would say early in playing this game, like without experience, I think the free peoples might have the advantage in the sense of, well, there's just so many opportunities to pick holes at the imperfect moves that the Shadow player is making. Whereas when you gain experience, I think I find the free peoples a little bit more challenging to play well, because you actually need to make precise incursions most of the time. And if you waste a move, if you entered battle and it didn't quite go the way you wanted, like, your pieces are such a much smaller or such a larger margin when you're losing one.
That's right? True. Yeah. Especially those poor veterans.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I don't know. It's such a mixed bag. I have had experiences in either way. Yeah, I would say the same with War of the Ring. Actually, I've introduced people to that game by playing the Fellowship or the Free Peoples as well. Again, it's the pacing element of the Shadow armies in both games is a pretty key thing. Absolutely.
Yeah, I appreciate that from, like, people that are going to be getting into it, just know which side, knowing the nuances of the different sides is extremely important in planning that, in going in with the right mindset.
Exactly.
So we've jumped around with, like, what the different characters can do, but overall, how would you say the characters impact the Battle of Five Armies? From taking back, looking at the board from the very top, like the ending scene in The Hobbit, the cartoon Hobbit. That's actually, like, if you go back and watch it, it does not hold up very well. It's just a whole bunch of little dots moving around. Yes, it is.
I remember that.
What does that look like, though, here with our characters entering? Like, what sort of impact do you think without those characters? Do you think that that is essentially the game for the good players? Is there certain, like, patterns that you're waiting to happen before you start approaching areas of the map with the good players?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a large portion of the Free People players game. Characters just play such a key role because, you know, the game is about this battle. So it is about getting little edges and margins on combat, whether it's in combat or whether it's outside of combat. It is about recruiting more units because that's a limiting factor for the free peoples. The Shadow has much more ability, it seems, to like muster and recruit units. And we didn't even mention the hordes of goblins that come streaming down the mountains as well.
That sounds awesome.
I was gonna get there. I was wondering, like, you know, how does that, because that always seemed to me like, you know, in my games as the Shadow player, I really tried to pack those goblins as quickly as I could, and I wasn't sure if that was the right move. So could you explain how the goblins work then a little bit for people? Because it's nothing like anything that I remember in War of the Ring.
Yeah, so they use the Sauron's Eye face of the dice to essentially they turn it into a goblin dice face. And it's this specific unit that just continues to muster in these two mustering zones that are apart from those other shadow mustering zones that you're mentioning, Joe, which are quite distant on the board. So these are like essentially what, you know, it's mimicking that part of the story where these goblins unexpectedly rush down the mountain into the combat. And so these mustering zones are actually right in the midst, in a sense, in the heart of the Free People's territory, but they're not accessible until they get to a certain number of units. And I think it's 5 units that you need. And then you can now send this little horde of goblins rushing down the mountain right into the midst of things. It's one of those things that, or one of the elements of the game that I find is just a timing piece. You know, if you're rolling a lot of eyes early in the game and those muster up quite quickly, then hey, use it to your advantage at that point in time. If it's something that builds a little bit more slowly, then I tend to try to forget it. I almost tend to try to make my opponent forget about it. Right? And slowly you're just kind of adding 1 unit here and there, and they're incredibly important mid and late game for the Shadow player, because that's probably at the point where you've stretched yourself quite thin with your first massive armies and perhaps that sort of second wave that you've mustered in, and that yet you have this sort of like this little backup plan, this valve that's ready to burst. And you know, it's one of those things where you want to set yourself up with your primary armies that you've brought in a way that will sort of, you know, benefit. They'll both benefit each other.
And it gives you like that opportunity to do the age-old military move, the pincer strategy.
Yeah, and you know what? That's actually one of the other differences between this combat system. We'll just mention this briefly here. This combat system from War of the Ring is here you have something called combined attacks that you can do. So if you encircle an army in a region with multiple armies of your own, you can then bounce sort of back and forth round to round in combat, attacking that army with different ones. So that whole damage accumulation thing isn't as pronounced as it would be if you're just going head to head, army to army.
Ooh, yeah.
Oh.
Very, very much adding that pincer move in and adding the ability to, you know, to take hits and then be able to kind of tag off. It's it can certainly, like I said earlier, isolating and exterminating is the name of the game, and that's the way you can really do it. And these goblins, since they start on the absolute opposite side of the map, you know, like I think what I was missing about that in my games was that I was, you know, when I got them, I was like so focused on getting that ready. But really, what I should do with those goblins is almost, you know, slow roll, put 1 or 2 in, and then, you know, bust them all out at once. But when my opponent has already forgotten or, you know, made adjustments without taking them into consideration.
Yeah, or at least bring them out when you also have support nearby. Like I find one of the things that you probably feel the desire to do is as soon as you have an army, throw it into the fray. And you know, if they're unsupported, it's likely not going to be a good decision.
You have more plastic, but it goes away quite quickly.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And here you've mentioned that the victory points in this game is divided into different sort of values of fortifications and settlements. There are actual like some settlements that start the game quite close to the Shadow players' mustering zones. You know, so they kind of like seem like vulnerable spots, like on that east side of the mountain. What would you say? You know, like in terms of what do you generally shoot for as that Shadow player? Do you like to flood into the middle of the board? Do you like to sort of go into the mountains? You know, what do you think is the what is the formula, you know, for in terms of how do you react to where the good players' units are at in terms of catching the right amount of points and getting them for, you know, only minimal losses, acceptable
Well, I mean,
losses.
this is where the primary fun is, I think, for the shadow player, right? Is deciding upon your strategy at the beginning of the game, saying, "I'd like to try this," or "I'd like to try that," and trying to push yourself away from formulas is something I think is rewarded in this game quite a lot. Trying for Ravenhill, way out on the far west side of the board, right? And so just to give you a sense of what the board would look like, there are 3 what's called fortifications, and these are worth 4 victory points each, but they have a sort of pre-existing fortification value, which your shadow army, when you're attacking, damage isn't applied to that Free People's Army. It's first applied to that fortification until it's broken, essentially. And so that makes those really defensible positions, and they act much like the strongholds in War of the Ring, is where when you sort of turtle in there, they have this, you know, sort of extra defensive value, and those are the places where the Free People needs to make decisions of like, do I roll some units in there quickly before the shadow comes my way to hold those positions, or do I use them as, you know, a bit more nimble forces on the outside of those? And so when the shadow player is attacking, maybe I'll make another little skirmish attack and try to take out the shadow at the heels from outside.
Yeah, what you just said here really made me interested. Like when I played Battle of Five Armies, I felt like as a shadow player, like in my games, it felt like the good player just always won. But that was probably because, like you said, it takes more experience to play as the shadow player, but you set the pace. You come at it with a strategy. You know, there really isn't a huge bunch of randomness in terms of what options are available to you, but what you can do and how you can catch the good player off guard is really wherein lies the decision space. And that's what's interesting to me is I'd never considered that like, you know, the shadow player is so in control of dictating the pace and the battlefields, you know, where and with whom, you know, whom you're going to attack. And just to me, I'd never really seen it as that. And the fact that you're saying that in your games, you become more experienced and you become more able to maneuver these shadow armies and to come up with, you know, traps to lure the good players into. You're telling me like the different functions of these units in this area, you know, like do you, as a good player, do you sort of like beef them up? Well, if you beef them up and the shadow player comes and attacks you, you made the right move. But if you beef them up and the shadow player was already poised to, you know, swoop to a different area, you've just essentially, you know, created.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I sometimes make those decisions on the fly as I'm the shadow player, right? Like I come in thinking I want 2 or 3 possible targets. And so you arrange your army within a region that is in striking distance. And there are some that are really key locations to maybe two different regions. And so you sort of make feigns, right? Like you're or feint or whatever, however you pronounce that word, but you sort of pretend like, hey, I'm going to attack this stronghold, and you lure perhaps maybe the Free Peoples to recruit there or spend dice. And this is one of those key functions of this game is the expenditure of dice is like an economy, right? Like, every dice counts for something. And if you can make your opponent spend more dice reactionarily or uselessly, like bringing units in somewhere that you're not even going to attack anymore, you gain these tiny little margins throughout the game. And so, yeah, I've done it before where I've, you know, lured someone to bring extra units into a stronghold and said, forget it, I'm going to go attack this now somewhat emptied camp area or the ruins of Dale because it's close by. And I find you can, because there's 20 victory points and you only need 10, you can sort of change directions pretty quickly. And the board itself is like, it looks, again, it's not this intuitive thing. If you study it a little bit, you realize I can get to some locations that are much more vulnerable, and I'm going to spend maybe 2 dice to get there, but I probably would have spent 3 or 4 dice in combat rounds trying to take down that other stronghold, and I would have gained the same number of points in the end. You know, it's a bit of a, there's calculations all over the place.
Well, and the calculation is also being made even prior to that, because you have composed your army full of different units, and we've mentioned how those different units can be used differently in battles and might have different, you know, strengths against, especially if you've got a strength against a particular type of unit. But it's also like the terrain on this board is quite important. And when you're composing an army, I can just imagine, like, I could see you playing as a shadow player here, Luke, and you've like got this entire army composed and you start in a certain direction. I would almost be looking more at the composition of your army and what, you know, because each of these units that you've composed your army of has like a home terrain sort of thing that is like fighting on its home turf, and it has like an advantage for that. So, you know, like you could kind of, like you said, maybe have an army that looks like it's going a certain direction, lure them that direction, and it's like, nope, guess what? I have the bonuses for here, and you're going down. It's there's layers on layers here.
There is. The combat is really layered in that sense. Like it's the combat layers start before the combat begins, right? It's all meshed within the tactics and the logistics and all that.
And
sort
that connects back to the dice, like you were talking about. Like you mentioned, like thematic games, and so many times a thematic game, quote unquote, will end up not even getting dice out until it's like, all right, check to see, you know, do a skill check or do a sanity check or whatever type of roll. Here, like, it is an economy that's all driven by these decisions that you're making, you know, and players will be familiar with that from War of the Ring, but it's also less, I want to say, like, this dice have more applicability to all of the game systems, you know?
Yeah. And something I'll say about the dice here quickly, I really like the fact that it's an uncertainty at the beginning of your turn what you can possibly do. Although you have all these strategic directions and everything, and you think, I'm likely going to be able to make 90% of this happen. There are these little twists that happen after you roll the dice, right? I've ended up on turns where I've rolled the dice and I end up with what I would consider a bad roll of, say, you know, 3 or 4 of these just card effect dice. Like, so all you can do is draw a card or play a card. And yet it gives you what I see in this sense is not a limitation, but opportunities, because now you're all of a sudden thinking, wow, I can play so many more cards this turn, or I can draw a couple cards and potentially open up the door for a different thing that I wasn't seeing, and particularly my opponent wasn't seeing. And in fact, I feel as though I've learned through this game that the cards are that hidden dynamic, right? Like you can see your opponent's dice and you can say, well, he's got, you know, 2 or 3 army movements, so they can probably only get this far and position themselves in that way and only make that many attacks. But if they have 2 or 3 card dice, like faces up, you actually have no idea what that player can do. And I think that's quite an interesting element. And so what I like almost more about the action dice system rather than a more traditional, what would you call it, I guess, action point system, where you have the, okay, so like, let's say there's 6 possible actions you can take, and you can just take, you know, 5 of those actions in whatever configuration in your turn. I find in that sort of a gaming system, I would get into ruts much more quickly than I would with this. This rolling the dice system creates these opportunities to exercise creativity.
Absolutely. And every round is a little bit of a puzzle for you to solve. Like you mentioned, like, you know, what happens when you roll something, you're like, oh, great, I rolled just the right thing, but that's not it. You're not just like, oh, great, I've got all the things that I was hoping to have. You have to use them in the right order. And
right timing.
If you see somebody that spent their last, you know, army die, the one that lets you actually move units, like, oh boy, like that can be the moment. Or, you know, if somebody spends their mustering in an opposite spot, you can then understand that you might have a couple of army dice that you're waiting on, and you're like, I want to see where he's gonna buff, so that way I can react to that. So it gives you an ability to see, like, you can see your opponent's action dice, right? You can see what they have at their disposal, and they can see yours. And I think that sort of open information, and also, you know, the randomization of the actions you can take, but there are game effects that can mess with what's on those dice too. It's not just simply like, well, this is what I rolled. Some of them have dual functions, and some of them actually let you sort of manipulate or re-roll dice.
No, leadership, yeah. So I mean, there's the 2 dice elements going on. Since we're on dice, we may as well talk about this. The action dice themselves, I love that system just for what I said. I think it creates space for creativity. Right? This little mini puzzle at the beginning of your game, or beginning of your turn, I should say. And often what I have found is I sort of look at them and I come up with like a bit of a strategy for that turn. And, you know, you have to decide which order you're going to play them in. But at the same time, dependent on what your opponent plays, I've said, oh, shoot, I'm so glad I still have that dice left because I need to now make this counter move. Or you just are devastated because you've used the key dice that you thought, I'm going to hold on to this as long as I can, but you played it a little too early and your opponent made like, you know, tactical advantage of you having played that early. And yeah,
you end up ruining your own possibilities. You end up being like, this is where I went wrong, which I feel like that's that type of thought that keeps haunting you later on afterwards.
Exactly.
Now, all of this that we've gone into mechanically, like this is a rich layer upon layer experience. And it is one thing that I think is leading you to feel that Battle of Five Armies, you know, I think I would love to call it a thematic game because I think that thematic is I see that as a very positive modifier. I don't care what other game might be called thematic. I think that that's really, really great that it is. Now, all that we've talked about so far is how it works as a game system. How do these like elements sort of connect back to your appreciation of its theme? Like, as you're playing, are you connecting it back towards like when you play War of the Ring to like this, like here's where we are in the story? Or is this more like a bit of creative art, if you will?
Yeah, I think the designers, again, have done such a great job of enmeshing the mechanics in a way that they drive the story of the game. It doesn't just feel like a mechanical experience when you're playing this game. Even though, like we're saying, you could peel apart the way these mechanics work quite a bit, and you could sort of do a little study of it that way. But I mean, this kind of a game is not an optimization puzzle, right? Like you don't have this, the conflicts that you encounter here are at every possible decision point. And I find that just incredibly interesting. I think this, like many other war games as well, offers the players the opportunity and the conditions for surprises. And I think surprises and for the possibility to take risks and for these kinds of creative opportunities that reward your spatial thinking and your intuition and your long-term strategic planning. These are the kind of things that just really connect with me as a gamer. And then once you're exercising all those things, once you're like nimble with the system, you're realizing that you're doing it all within the context of a narrative thing, right? And you're sort of creating stories, and you're creating these battles and these counter battles and these feigns and these like, you know, combined attacks and like all these things that at the end you sort of look back and you just like have these sort of deep breaths and realize that was incredible. That was really interesting what we created together, you know, as two players. And I think it really rewards that. I think the mechanics really lend themselves towards the telling of a story together.
TC, I want you to react to that.
I don't know. When you create something, did you create carnage?
Oh, there is carnage. Yeah.
Well, TC, you know, does it connect to where you come at from with a lot of the experiences that you're looking for?
Well, the experiences I'm looking for, especially in a two-player war game, is A, if there's different tactics you can take, and B, if there's some really good asymmetric things going on. I mean, the way you're talking is like, you're saying that a really experienced person has to play the shadow because the good armies can like really overpower them because the shadow player has to like end the game quickly. But what really got my attention is with most war games, it's imperative you control, especially a two-player game. It's imperative you control the pace of the game. If you're controlling the pace of the game, you've got 90% of the game under your belt. If you can get your opponent to react to you instead of like trying to figure out a strategy to overtake you. And that sounds like this has got that in spades. So this has really got me going. I mean, just that alone has got me very interested to try this thing out.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it there.
Yeah, for sure. We've talked a lot about the characters, and we've only mentioned the ones on the free people side. The shadow player has got Bolg. Now, I have a bit of a theory here, because one of the conditions by which the free people can win is defeating Bolg. I think that the free peoples get all these cool weapons, and the shadow player has to basically just guard a flag.
You know what? I think Bolg is such a brilliant part of this game design. He is both, I think, the most powerful and the most vulnerable character on the board, right? And it again, if you want to tie this in thematically or narratively, however you want to frame that, it's so perfect because this guy's got a vendetta, and his vendetta can screw over the entire plan of the army. You know?
Yeah, he definitely is. He comes out. I feel like, you know, that's sort of when you had Bjorn raging. I feel like that's the same way that Bolg wants to play.
Absolutely, and he's the Achilles heel of the shadow in essence. If Bolg is killed, the shadow loses. And trust me, I have had, I think, 2 games where Bolg has been defeated
because it goes down in flames
because of my overextension, right? So one of the elements of this character, essentially, he adds a number of rerolls for whichever army he's attached to, and a number of combat strength. So just like the ability to roll more dice. And what he also does is he brings in these bodyguard tokens along with him. And so it's sort of like you have this massive character who's got this little horde of bodyguards that if you're going to take damage in a round of combat, you can forfeit that token to basically absorb whatever number of damage is going to be applied to you. So Bolg enters play with only one of those tokens unless, and here's these, you know, interweaving incentives, unless the shadow controls the Ruins of Dale, which is sort of right in the middle of the board in this valley area. And it's like a highly contested spot. And so what the game, one of those incentives for the shadow is to maybe push to take Dale. And after you've taken Dale, bring Bolg in because he'll interplay with 3 bodyguards. And I mean, that's 3 rounds of combat that you can sort of slough off. That's a pretty powerful combat effect, or defensive combat effect specifically.
Oh yeah.
The problem is, right, you want to send Bolg in that army because you just you know that you have a lot of steamrolling power right towards the front gate, let's say. And I've gotten into these situations where, you know, I've taken out a number of armies, but then you don't expect the free people to attack you, but they're thinking, I'm going to go all out. If I take Bolg out of the game, this thing's over.
Yeah, you got it.
It's a magnet.
The free people are willing to go sort of kamikaze on Bolg a little bit, and it's quite interesting that dynamic within that character.
Yes, considering that he doesn't start the game in play, but you bring him in at a certain point, and it is, like you said, it changes the whole dynamic, and it really can cause players to go out of their, you know, out of where they've been playing. And you can, you know, it's that carrot that you can dangle.
And yet it's such a tempting choice to make as the shadow because he's just so important. And not only does he bring in the bodyguards and his own effects, I think he also does quite a lot of recruitment when he comes into play. I think you're bringing in, like, you know, 8 or something tokens worth of units that get flipped over. So yeah, it's one of those, major tensions.
It is. Yeah. It's something that's, not only is it major tension, it's also like tied entirely to something that feels very much evocative of what we're going for, you know, of this particular intellectual property, you know, this instance, this battle. So it's every little piece here. We've got just a dozen little pieces, and every single unit, you know, like to compare this to War of the Ring. In War of the Ring, you mentioned the only difference is between regulars and elites. And that made me to thinking of them as not so much the actual characters they were, but just a little plastic piece on a gigantic, beautiful game board, nonetheless, but just a little plastic piece, you know, it's essentially one strength. Here, it's like every single one of these units, Bolg himself included, has a personality of its own, a special ability, a home terrain, you know, something that connects to make this, in my opinion, what is not only mechanically rich, but also thematically rich. You know, it connects on both of those planes. And that's why I had a question to ask you here. As a huge fan of War of the Ring, who's connected with the designers, who's aware of, you know, these expansions from first edition that's, you know, so long ago, is War of the Ring something that you think that Battle of Five Armies can backwards impact? Or what do you think? You know, is there a way that we could see the sort of combat system in some capacity in like third edition War of the Ring,
or an upgrade, expansion, an expansion?
And I think that's likely something they're toying with the third expansion. From what I understand, like the collector's edition, which I don't have because it's like thousands of dollars at this point, or whatever it is.
Zillions and zillions of dollars.
Yes. Included sort of this initial massive expansion, which now they've divided into 3 pieces, right? And so the one piece is Lords of Middle-earth, which is a sort of character-driven expansion. And the second one is Warriors of Middle-earth, which adds something they call factions to War of the Ring. And I love Lords of Middle-earth. I think it's almost essential. I would play it every time with that. Warriors, I find, changes the game enough that it becomes a slightly different game. And I both like and don't like that in some ways, because I find it takes away from that overall narrative experience that I have with War of the Ring, with sort of the overall, and I hate using mushy words like this, but like the feeling I get of playing War of the Ring. It doesn't feel like War of the Ring in quite the same way. And it sort of, Warriors sort of focuses the game at different times in different geographic locations, because these factions are connected to different geographies in Middle-earth. What I've heard the third expansion is going to be is sort of a elaborated version of that element of the collector's edition expansion that had to do with siege engines. So again, I don't know where the designers are going to take that, but I imagine it's going to be a bit more of a combat focused expansion. That would be
it certainly sounds that way.
Yeah.
So whether that will be good or not, I mean, at this point in time, I sort of look at War of the Ring and I just think it's got so much going on in it already. I'm not sure if like you're saying, Joe, the backward impact of applying a more complex combat system is necessarily a benefit to War of the Ring. I think it's quite a well-refined machine as it is. And I mean, when we start talking about like game length and stuff, like I'm not sure if I'm going to have the chance to play a 5 or 6 hour War of the Ring game if all these combat additions are added to it. Whereas if I can play it now in 2.5, 3 hours and I can play it a lot, and I love it, that's that to me is much more valuable.
Absolutely. I get where you're coming at from that perspective. I think that with War of the Ring, you know, the game is basically combat-wise is a fairly simple logistics game, you know, where it's a matter of getting the right units in the right spots. And, you know, aside from a little bit of combat cards, you're not going to see much more. But it's because there's other systems that really enrich the gaming experience, especially that sort of hunt for the ring, the ring track that, you know, really is like, it's in its last, you know, in its last act, the game sort of turns to its eye on that track. Grown. So I think though, I want it to, Luke, when it comes down to it, you know, I want War of the Ring to have that combat. I really do, because I just love the combat system here, and it's the combat of War of the Ring that sort of just leaves me feeling like the rest of the game has such interesting thematical things I can do, you know. But like you said, the combat, like playing a card for combat, feels like crap because that card has another special ability that's tied to the theme of the game, and I'm so much more engaged when I'm playing that aspect of War of the Ring that, you know, that I feel like, you know, maybe instead War of the Ring should turn into like a several hour diplomacy focused. You know, like you get to create the story of the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, but you have to sort of negotiate it out with your partner. You know, like maybe that's because that's my favorite thing about it. You know, I really do enjoy that part. Whereas the Battle of Five Armies made me look directly at the combat and be like, hold on, you know, when these designers really focus on this element, they can put these pieces and layer them in so that every decision is difficult. And the way that those action dice work with it, you know, that same sort of system when applied to a more complex combat, to me, it stood sturdy.
Well, and here would be my argument. That's a great reason for both these games to be in your collection. So
I played right into your pen.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You know what? There's often times where I feel the itch to play this game over War of the Ring because it gives you something a little different, and I'm glad that it does. And I would actually, it might even be a design team flaw if they would make these games too similar. right? Like they are games in and of themselves, as much as they share a sort of history of systems that drive these games. I think the designers have done a good job of sort of making them their own animals. And I mean, for obvious purposes, you want to be able to, you know, sell this game as much as you want to sell the other one, but you also want a game that itself is a good experience as much as the other one is. So,
maybe this game is kind of their answer to. I know that I'm not alone in saying that, you know, that the combat system in War of the Ring is really, it's basically Risk. I mean, you know, there are some more possibilities. And have I totally lost you now, Luke? You're like, I'm done. I quit.
No, it's I see where you're coming from.
Okay. That's politeness. That's Canadian. That's the Canadian word for no.
Yeah. I think it is more simplistic, and I think it has to be, again, within the context of a larger, like the scope of the game being so much larger. But I would argue that there are like quite a number of possibilities within combat. There's the stronghold dynamic. There is a massive logistics game. I think the cards, as much as you're saying the combat effects don't give the sort of narrative, you know, element in the same way as the event element of the cards. There's a few cards I remember. This was early on in my plays of War of the Ring. All of a sudden looking like, yeah, in the early days, all of a sudden realizing I should always be reading the combat effect, you know, whenever I pick up a card. And I remember once stumbling upon this one, which you sort of bookmark it and are like, that exists. It's one of these ones where it says, if a hobbit, I think, I'm not gonna quote this wrong, but basically if one of the hobbits is in battle, you can eliminate a shadow character. And it's the perfect card. If you hold on to it and if you attack the army with the Witch King and you have that combat card, it represents exactly in the story of Mary basically like attacking the Witch King, right?
Wait, when does that? Oh my gosh, man! I was still in the middle of. Oh, I just finished 2 Towers. You got to be kidding me. Spoiler. No, I'm just giving you a hard time. No.
Yeah, back in 02 there. Yeah.
Back in 02. Spoiler alert. Also, Snape kills Dumbledore. So
run.
No, you're right. And we talked about this on the Lord of the Rings of Confrontation, how like that sort of thematic connection really ties you and grounds you, and it brings you back to just like the sort of, you know, you're ping-ponging back between I love this game for its mechanisms and Lord of the Rings. It is Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. And I think what it does well is what both these games do well is the mechanics do sort of move aside, and you sort of realize that you now have tools to play with, right, within this world, within this system. And
Sure. I think that there was more artistic license that they could take with the Battle of Five Armies, simply because this is a really, you know, it's an important aspect of the novel, but it's really under-described. And so anything, they could have added whatever they wanted. And I think at that point, they were able to really just get, like, they were just like, we're going to just get mechanical here. And not to say that that's lacking in War of the Ring. Like, War of the Ring has just this, you know, a phenomenal timing and you know, the Hunt for the Ring system. So much that they've rolled that into its own separate game on its own. So I just think that you can see more, like, you know, necessarily do I remember in the book when, you know, when it said that I do remember, you know, the goblin mustering, but it's like, you know, there's a lot of these little aspects that I feel like, you know, the actual maneuvers are not enumerated in the novels, and they're able to really kind of take, you know, build the game and then make the theme work with it too.
I think this is probably a good bridge to talk about the audience for this game.
Yeah.
Like I think we'd mentioned before here, is this game simply for Tolkien fans, or can any gamer pick it up and consider it a worthy game to play or an interesting game to play? Now, TC, have you played Battle of Five Armies? You said no, right?
No, I have not. I have played War of the Ring, and I enjoyed it quite a bit, but I have not played Battle of Five Armies.
Now, are you a Tolkien fan at all?
Yes, mainly because of my wife. I read the books and she drugged me to the movies. I like them fine.
Yeah.
With the Hobbit ones, I understand that. I
Yeah.
was not exactly looking forward to those releases as they came out.
So I have sort of two minds on this. I think a bit more of a hardcore Tolkien fan will probably get a little bit more out of these games. Just because they'll connect the dots between what the cards are doing mechanically and the narrative element they're trying to recreate. If you've read the stories, if you're sort of familiar with that sort of a thing. But I think most people, if not all people, are somewhat aware of Lord of the Rings just because it's been so pervasive in the last 15 years or whatever. I think we all have a bit of an awareness of the general story. And I mean, this game itself also, like any sort of fantasy game, you could pick it up. It probably, like within the rule book, you could read a little bit about the game itself and dive right in, whether or not you're a Tolkien fan or not. If you have an interest in this sort of a battle system, if you're a war gamer of sorts that enjoys these kinds of conflict, that's not total simulation, but these sorts of conflict board games, I think
a tactical war game. Yeah.
I think it does a great job of doing that in a different way than other tactical type war games.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
Not that I have a broad experience of those either, but I've played my share of GMT games, and this does something different than those two.
Yeah, so the audience is definitely you, because it's like we got a Venn diagram here, and I think that there is strengths in both sides, but definitely for that core, for the place where they both meet, essentially the you and the me's. This absolutely, delivered on a lot of different fronts. So not one that deserved to be shooed underneath the shadow of the War of the Ring.
And I would say similarly, I probably came at these games from the background of being enamored with the IP. Right, like that's probably what drew me to the War of the Ring. I can't remember now; it was a little while ago. But there's been other games like I remember I bought Fire in the Lake when it came out because I was completely interested in wanting to learn about the Vietnam War, and I really hadn't done much study on that. And I remember the game inspired me to dig more deeply. I bought a book on it. I watched Full Metal Jacket, got traumatized. That sort of but I think what games do really well as a medium is invite us into these sorts of things, right? And the best ones probably send us off looking in multiple other mediums to get our fill of whatever setting that they're portraying.
Absolutely. What do you think about that, TC?
Yeah, I mean, well, what got my attention is that you said that the theme will make sense, will make the game make more sense, and that's true for historical games too. I mean, you're playing a war game, and you're not familiar with at least the history of the war, and you're playing like Washington's War, and you're like, as Americans, I'm just going to go toe-to-toe with the British, and I'm going to win. You're going to find out very, very, very quickly that is absolutely not the case. So it does inform like the decisions you make in the game, and I'm just curious. I was going to ask you: does being familiar with the theme and the story, does that help you play the game more effectively or not?
No, and mostly because, like we were saying, the novelization, like the last chapter in The Hobbit, really doesn't give you any tactical or strategic advantage. Yeah. Whereas maybe it does within certain war games, right? Like if you know a little bit of the tactics. I mean, my goodness, I don't know if you noticed, I've got Napoleon's Triumph on the shelf here. Yeah, I have tried really hard. It's a very difficult game, and I imagine knowing a little bit about the battle itself would probably actually help my play of that game.
Or like right behind you got Twilight Struggle. I mean, knowing a little bit of history of the Cold War helps immensely playing that game, because going into it as the Americans, you're going to have the underhand pretty significantly. You just got to go in for the long haul on that thing. But yeah, so it's curious because you're like, you were mentioning that, the war, this actual battle is like not mentioned in the book very much at all, and how that impacts, the theme to actually playing the game to how it's implemented. So that's kind of interesting.
Well, I hope you can pick it up, TC, and give it a try sometime.
Oh, I will. But I was just looking at it now, and that probably brings up another question. I was looking at the availability of this thing, and it looks like it's fairly out of print. It looks like War of the Ring is actually a little easier to find.
Yeah, they did.
Battle of Five Armies.
I think they did a reprint of War of the Ring not too long ago here. Ares is pretty good with keeping things in stock, but I'm not sure what their plan is with Battle of Five Armies.
Yeah, it looks like there's like, because I was kind of looking at it just a while ago, is like going for like over $100. I'm like, well, I'm not gonna be trying this game anytime soon unless someone actually has it, which I do know someone who does. It's in Shrink, and he has a whole bunch of games on the shelf that we need to. Well, right next to that shelf of GMT games we need to get going. But yeah, it's been fascinating listening to talk about this thing.
This was really enjoyable.
Yeah, you know, I usually stay quiet because Joe takes the lead and he asks all the questions I want to. So it's just, I was curious like how the combat system's different, because like in War of the Ring, I always felt like, you know, here comes the shadow player, you know, he's gonna crush everything, and as a good player, you're like, I gotta sneak this little arm, you know, the fellowship around, and as a bad player, like, well, I gotta start looking for this thing, and where my focus to be. And you know, while you were talking about how the combat is simplistic in War of the Ring, there's much more nuance in that game because there's much more going on. Where this one just sounds like a freaking battle going down, right? So that's in terms of a battle game, that's got me interested. And it's just got beautiful components. The artwork is fantastic. I don't know. Yeah, it sounds like if you can find a copy of this thing, you should pick it up. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll read you here if we're getting to the close here. But one of the questions I asked Roberto and his answer, I just said, simple question: what do you love about Battle of Five Armies? And this is from the designer. He said, I think it offers a genuine, true to the source simulation of a story, which is so engaging and dramatic. Just like War of the Ring, it's exactly the type of game that, as a Tolkien fan and a lover of thematic games, I would like to play. So you can sort of just, you know, his vision right for there. It, his design vision, pretty summed up.
And the fact that you mentioned earlier, you're like heavy into 18xx games, but the fact this game can still pull you back from that, I think that speaks a lot to the game. It really does. Because those games are such a rabbit hole of, once you get into them, you're like, they just absorb your time. You're like, dude, I want to figure what I did wrong. I did this wrong. I figure out how to do this. If I can do this, I can get the training. I can crash the company. I know 1846 fried my brain, and people are saying, oh, that's just the start of the slope.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the beginning of it.
But I mean, the similarities I find as a gamer between 18xx and this, not that there are many mechanically and whatnot, but what we've been talking about layer upon layer, like we've been able to spend an hour and a bit just unpacking the decision-making spaces here. And I think that's what I look for as a gamer, right? I like the decision-making space that's involved in 18xx, and it packs a punch, right? But this game also packs a punch, and they're different for sure. There's differences all over the place, but I mean, I find I get a lot out of games when I'm confronted with multiple decisions, tensions, challenges, hurdles, you know, all these sorts of things. And yeah, I think this game and 18xx do that quite well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I can definitely see it. And like I said, the fact that this game can pull you back, that just speaks to it. And it's always nice to have a game. You know, for me, it just depends what kind of mood I'm in, but it's always nice to have a game like, you know what? I just feel like having a nice confrontation with another person. And I just want a fantasy battle. Let's go. We got it right here. Break it out, man. Let's go.
You could just get into a podcast.
Oh yeah, that too.
Yeah, well, TC, your thoughts on this were really that's really insightful. I mean, from the perspective of somebody that's you know, like you're more like of the type of war gamer that I think that Luke has alluded to. You know, that this is the type of experience that offers something that is, you know, is something that's different. You know, I feel like it sits somewhere in between that tactical war game and then like something like Kemet. Like you mentioned, Luke, where, you know, and then, you know, IP and everything else, all the other little bits and pieces aside, it sits somewhere in that space, because, you know, it does feel like the designer intended to be that simulation, but also has decision points that feel quite comfortable from coming from, you know, I think just about any, you know, from any sort of popular mainstream games. I know that's a very wishy-washy statement. I wanted to say Euro games, but I really don't. I don't know, man. Like, you know, like maybe Kemet has those, but I feel like, you know, the dice choosing what to do with your dice is adds a solid mechanical undertow to what is already a very rich thematic simulation.
Yeah, no, I think you hit it there. It is a bit of a crossover in a sense between those kinds of tactical war games and the Kemet style. It has elements of for lack of a better term, right? Euro games, like the action selection, etc. Area control, all these things. It blends all this quite well.
Yeah, and it definitely sounds like a game that I would probably. Kate's getting to the point where she wants to play battle games, but she's still into like fantasy genre, and this sounds like something I would just rip out just pretty quick.
Absolutely,
she's right there on that, and then maybe like, hey, now we've got historical war games, right? Let's kind of go up the ladder here. But I've got her into worker placement, so we're just taking things little steps at a time. I figured the secret with the worker placement was making them imps. Thank you, Joe. That was the secret.
This will be that next step then.
Yeah.
Maybe they got a rental copy at your store.
Yeah.
All right. Well, is there any final closing statements? I think that what you said was the perfect capstone here on this discussion. The designer's quote himself, couldn't have said it better than him.
Yeah. Exactly. So, no, this was great, guys. Thanks for the chance to chat about it. It was quite a lot of fun.
Well, Luke, this isn't going to be the last time we hear from you.
I think we're going to have to do a Longview crew, Joe. We've already got like 4 or 5 people we want to bring back. I just think what we should do is like pick a game, have a crew, and so we're going to talk about this one game and have like everyone put their 5 cents in. Like that.
Wow.
What do you think?
Well,
I hate it. I like it. It's okay. I hate it. I like it. I really hate it. It's okay. There we go.
Sounds like the tattered board, TC. Yeah. So, well, I think that Luke, though, with the homework that you did, it was just an absolutely incredible, having the designer input, having your place, being able to talk from a lot of different viewpoints, vantage points. It was very, very insightful and something that I certainly appreciated. It's great to hear from another Tolkien fanatic, and just in general, man, thank you for coming on. It was a great first appearance, and I'm hoping first of many.
Yes, I'd love to hear you talk some more. It'd be great.
Well, we'll have to talk about something different. We're not going to get pigeonholed here, are we?
No, absolutely not. Now, Luke, before we say goodbye at all, I want to give you an opportunity here to tell everybody, toot your own horn here. Like you've come on, you've done your homework, you've done the episode. Now tell us, to be able to, this is not the only game system that you play. Obviously, we've talked about what you've done with 18xx games in terms of just getting involved in those. Tell everybody about where maybe they can find you.
Okay. Well, for those of you who've listened to the end of a 2-hour podcast and are ready for an advertisement, this is going to fall in a few years, right? But
hey, TC can always take it, and he can place it somewhere else.
I can make it louder.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. I'm one of the co-facilitators of a board gaming convention that's specific to train games called Hattanooga, which is a bit of the tip of the hat to Chattanooga, but it takes place in Medicine Hat in Alberta, Canada. It's probably Canada's only specifically train game convention, and we have a big focus on 18xx, Winsome titles, and Crayon Rails, and Age of Steam, of course. Sure, and it happens on the May long weekend in Canada, which for this upcoming year is May 20th and 21st. Well, I should say 20th, 21st, 22nd. We try to hit 3, possibly 4 days of gaming, depending on how long you'd like to come up for that. If anyone's interested in learning 18xx, we started this convention last year, and so it's one of these things that's growing. And I would say it has an appeal both for a new 18xx player or a new player to train games of any kind, and also to those who have quite a bit of experience. I think in part because Tyler McLaughlin, who is the other co-facilitator, he owns what I think is the largest 18xx collection in the world. He's got almost every title, and I know he sees himself as a little bit of an archivist. So if you're new to the system, this is a completely fascinating event because you get to see sort of like the depth of where this can go. If you're a moderate or like a bit of a newbie, which is what I'd still consider myself, having played 18xx games for a year, this is like a kid in a candy shop. I mean, you get to go and you can choose any out of print, super rare 18xx to hit the table with that you want. That's really exciting. And if you're a veteran, I think there are some fantastic players that have been coming from around Canada. We have a few people coming up from the States and maybe even out from Europe this year. So it's a bit of a growing event. I'm super happy and proud to be part of its inception, and I plan to make it a bit of a yearly thing for myself.
Excellent. Well,
and I should just mention, if you're interested in the event, you can go to our website, which is www.hattanooga.ca.
.ca. Okay, that's why I wasn't finding it. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
If you know, .com is owned by a hat company, so. So we went with the Canadian domain.
As an 18xx fan, what do you think the odds of 1830 getting reprint anytime soon is?
I don't know. I've been reading on the forums. I feel like there's a sense that it's going to happen, but
I think it's coming. I think it's
I want it
sooner.
Well, in the meantime, we have some new GMT announcement of 1862, which is not your beginner 18xx, but I think it'll be quite an interesting one to have in print.
Andy says, take everything that people get confused with and mess up, like every messed up rule that's ever been in an 18xx game, and then make a game out of it.
Yeah, that's Mike Hutton, I think. He does a good job. He's done 1860 and 62. And if you really go scouring on BGG, look for 1833 and a third.
The third?
Or something like that. It's a tentative title right now. It's one of these things that's kind of in progress. But well, maybe Joe, I'll send you a link later. It's absolutely bananas what this guy's doing to push the system in different directions. It's just fantastic.
Oh wow. Yeah, get me that link, man. I'd be very interested to check out that. So, well, thanks for joining us. I hope that you have a great time at Hattanooga this coming May, and be no stranger to the long view. I expect to hear your input about 18xx games as we have them. I hope to have you on to talk about one in the future, and just in general, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe and TC. This was great.
Oh yeah, it's great having you.
Yep, thanks to you, TC. Thanks for joining everything, and for tolerating me grabbing the words out of your mouth at every turn.
I'm used to it. It's awesome. I'm like, I'll just ask this. No, we already asked. I'll ask this. Yes, I'm just gonna sit here and enjoy this. This is awesome.
Well, TC, you had some good statements there. You had a good perspective to share, so I appreciated hearing from you as well. Yeah. All right, that's this episode of The Long View. Make sure to catch out more episodes of The Long View where we take a closer look at the games people play.